Imagine living on just 99 cents a day. That's the average poverty line in the world's poorest countries. With such a tight budget, every choice matters. Do you spend that extra coin on food, on medicine, on sending your child to school, or maybe on a small treat to make life a bit more bearable? In their book, Poor Economics, Banerjee and Duflo invite us into this world of tough choices. They show that the poor, far from being helpless or irrational, are in fact astute decision makers navigating incredibly difficult constraints. As the authors put it, the poor are no less rational than anyone else. In fact, precisely because they have so little, they often think very carefully about how to survive and even find small joys. Understanding those choices is the key to fighting global poverty, and that's what we're here to explore in this deep dive into poor economics and how its lessons resonate in today's world of pandemics, inflation, and new ideas like universal basic income. It turns out that fighting poverty isn't about casting blame or finding a single silver bullet solution. Banerjee and Duflo emphasize that context matters immensely. They caution us to move beyond heated ideological debates, like whether massive foreign aid is a cure-all or a poison, and instead focus on evidence. What actually helps the poor in specific situations? In the 2000s, there was a fierce clash between two schools of thought. On one side, some experts argued poor countries are stuck in poverty traps and need a big push of aid to get out. On the other, skeptics claimed aid usually fails. It can breed dependency or corruption, so we'd be better off trusting markets and leaving people to find their own solutions. Banerjee and Duflo found a middle path. They don't pick a side in this all-or-nothing debate. Instead, they radically rethink the approach. Don't ask, is aid good or bad in general? Ask which specific policies and interventions make a difference. They write that, this book will not tell you whether aid is good or bad, but it will say whether particular instances of aid did some good or not. In other words, stop arguing in the abstract and start figuring out, on the ground, what works and what doesn't. It's a refreshingly pragmatic outlook. So, how do we figure out what works? The answer is with the same rigor a scientist uses to test a new drug. Banerjee and Duflo champion the use of randomized controlled trials, RCTs, in economics. Basically, running field experiments to measure the impact of anti-poverty programs. This was a revolutionary idea in development economics. Instead of relying on gut feeling or ideology, we can set up trials. One group of people, or villages, gets a program, another similar group doesn't, and we compare outcomes. It sounds simple, but it had rarely been done at large scale before. By the time Poor Economics was published in 2011, Banerjee, Duflo, and colleagues had already spent years running these experiments across the globe, from rural India to sub-Saharan Africa, testing things like free textbooks, microcredit loans, fertilizer subsidies, you name it. This approach mimics medical trials and yields concrete answers. Crucially, it also illuminates how poor people make decisions. As the authors note, when you investigate a small question, say, will charging a tiny fee for a malaria bed net affect whether poor families use them? You learn not just about bed nets, but about the psychology and constraints of poverty. In fact, one famous debate was precisely about bed nets. Some argued that giving them out for free would lead people to undervalue and maybe not use them, so a small price should be charged. Others felt any price would deter the poorest from getting this life-saving protection. Rather than theorize forever, researchers tried both approaches in Kenya. The result? Free bed nets massively increased uptake and were used just as much as the ones people bought. In the end, the evidence was so strong that global health policy changed. By the mid-2010s, hundreds of millions of free bed nets were being distributed, contributing to a 75% drop in malaria deaths. Even a prominent skeptic of aid publicly admitted he was wrong on this issue when the data proved otherwise. This is the kind of real-world impact that Banerjee and Duflo's experiment don't assume philosophy has had. It's about small steps, carefully tested, that taken together can start what they call a quiet revolution in how we fight poverty. All right, but what did these experiments and studies actually reveal about the lives of the poor? Let's journey through some core insights from Poor Economics. Each insight tackles a common assumption or a big question about poverty and turns it into a concrete, solvable puzzle. And along the way, we'll see how these findings still matter today. In a world that's been rocked by a global pandemic, surging inflation, and renewed debates on how to support those in need. First stop, food and hunger. It seems obvious that the poorest people in the world, those who often don't get enough to eat, would spend any extra money on food. If you're consuming, say, 1,500 calories when you really need 2,000, surely the moment you have a bit more cash, you'd buy more rice or bread, right? And indeed, one long-standing idea in development economics was the existence of a hunger-based poverty trap. The poor stay poor because they're physically weak from malnutrition and thus less productive at work, so they earn little and remain malnourished. It's a vicious cycle, at least in theory. But Banerjee and Duflo discovered a fascinating twist. In many cases, when poor families' income rises a bit, they do not spend it all on more calories. Instead, they often buy slightly better tasting or more nutritious food, or small luxuries like sugar or spice, maybe a piece of meat for flavor, or they might even spend on a festival or a television if they can afford it. This isn't because they're irresponsible, it's because being human isn't just about survival, it's about living. As Banerjee put it in a recent talk, even very poor people don't spend their entire income on food. It's the distinction between surviving and living. For example, consider an experiment cited in Poor Economics. In a region of India, a policy tried to make staple food more affordable by subsidizing the price of rice by 10%. The expectation was people would buy and eat more rice. Instead, rice consumption actually dropped slightly in that area. Why? Because with rice cheaper, families could spend the money they saved on slightly more enjoyable foods. In fact, the local demand for shrimp went up. People treated themselves to a bit of tastier protein once their bellies were no longer ravenous. It's a striking example of how the poor prioritize quality and happiness once their basic hunger is sated. In practical terms, this means there may not be an automatic hunger trap. Once people can get enough basic food, they seek better diets, not infinite bowls of rice. It also means that anti-poverty programs need to account for human nature. If you give a poor family a little extra money, don't be shocked if they buy a sweet or a ticket to a movie. That bit of relief and joy is part of escaping the mental strain of poverty. And in times of crisis, understanding this is crucial. Think about the recent inflation surge we've seen around the world. In 2021, global food prices jumped by over 20%, the highest spike in a decade. For a family living in extreme poverty, who might spend 40% or more of their income on food, compared to, say, 17% in a rich country, that kind of inflation is devastating. Suddenly, even maintaining those basic calories becomes hard, let alone buying a bit of protein or a small luxury. Many more people could fall into true hunger. This is where Banerjee and Duflo's lesson guides us. Policies in such times should directly help the poor afford food, whether through subsidies, food aid, or cash transfers, because otherwise inflation can shove people down into a real calorie deprivation trap. In fact, during the recent global COVID-19 economic crisis, many governments did exactly that. They expanded food assistance and cash support to millions of vulnerable households to offset the shock. Those policies resonate with the idea that we must pay attention to how the poor actually behave and what they need in context. In this case, when prices soar, getting extra help to buy enough food or essentials is critical. Next, let's talk about health and healthcare. Often extremely inexpensive solutions to health problems go unused in poor communities. Imagine a life-saving vaccine available for free at the local clinic, yet some parents don't get their children immunized. Or consider bed nets. Even at a couple of dollars, not everyone buys one to prevent deadly malaria. It's easy to jump to conclusions. Maybe they're ignorant or they just don't care. But poor economics shows the reality is more subtle. Poor people do care about health, but they face many hurdles. Clinics that are far away or often closed, treatments they may not fully trust, and human nature issues like procrastination. One of my favorite examples from the book comes from rural Udaipur, India, where child immunization rates were abysmally low, just a few percent, despite vaccines being free. Banerjee and Duflo, working with local partners, wanted to understand why. They set up immunization camps in villages, making access easier by bringing the service to the people. And they tried a small twist in some villages, offering a modest incentive to parents. What was it? A bag of lentils as a reward for each round of shots, plus a set of metal plates if you completed all the required vaccinations. Now lentils are a basic food, worth less than $1, but it was just enough to nudge families to overcome inertia. The outcome was astounding. Simply holding regular, reliable vaccine camps raised vaccination rates several-fold. And adding the lentil incentive boosted them much more. Villages with the lentil reward saw 6 times higher full immunization rates than villages without it. That meant over a third of children were fully immunized in those incentive villages, versus only about 6% in the places with the old, unreliable system. Not only did this save lives, it even turned out to be cost-effective. The incentive drew so many more people that the cost per vaccination fell by almost half, because the health workers' time was better utilized. A field experiment in rural India offered parents a kilogram of lentils as a small reward for vaccinating their children. This modest incentive, combined with convenient monthly immunization camps, led to a 6-fold increase in full child immunization rates. Such evidence shows that tackling practical barriers in human behavior quirks can dramatically improve health outcomes for the poor. The Lentils for Vaccines story beautifully illustrates Banerjee and Duflo's approach. It wasn't a grand, expensive program. It was a cheap tweak that treated people not as statistics, but as humans who sometimes need a little encouragement to do what's good for them. The poor often live without the nudges and conveniences that wealthier folks take for granted. Think about it. If you have money, clean water comes out of your tap automatically. You don't have to purify it daily. If vaccines are required for school in a rich country, parents get reminders and compliance is monitored. But a poor parent might have to walk miles to a clinic only to find the nurse absent, which was common in the India study, and then remember to come back multiple times. When life is that hard, it's understandable that something like vaccinating your kid can slip down the priority list when nothing bad seems to happen immediately if you delay it. By providing a small reward and making the service reliable, the Udaipur program overcame both supply problems, unavailable nurses, and demand problems, procrastination, doubts. It's a lesson that many health interventions should heed. Sometimes the obstacle isn't ignorance at all, but inconvenience and lack of immediate payoff. Give people an instant benefit, even a bag of food, and they respond. During the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw a mirror of this logic worldwide. For example, some cities offered incentives like grocery vouchers or small cash payments to encourage COVID vaccination, knowing that a little nudge can boost uptake, especially among hesitant or busy populations. It's essentially the lentil approach updated for modern times. And it works because it respects people's agency. You're not forcing anyone. You're saying, we know you're busy and have worries, so here's something to make it a bit worth your while right now, because the long-term benefit, not getting sick, is easy to undervalue when you're struggling day to day. Now consider education. Education is universally hailed as a ladder out of poverty. Yet again, we see paradoxes. In many poor areas, despite free or cheap schooling, children drop out early or attend sporadically. Why? One common assumption was that poor parents don't value education or that they need their kids to work instead. Poor economics digs deeper. Banerjee and Duflo find that parents in poor countries often do believe education is key, but they also believe that education's returns are mostly realized only at a very high level, like college. If a child isn't an academic superstar, or if the family doubts the child will make it to the finish line, say due to costs or needing them to help at home, they might question the point of, for instance, completing middle school. There's evidence of an C-shaped belief curve. People think a little education does very little for income, but a lot of education does a lot. And sometimes they're not wrong. If job markets only reward diplomas, not partial schooling, that belief could be true. But it can become a self-fulfilling trap of low expectations. In one cited study in the Dominican Republic, researchers provided accurate information about the earnings bump that even an extra year or two of schooling can bring. Simply giving this info to families led to kids staying in school longer. The parents had underestimated the value of basic education. Once they learned it, they invested more in their children's schooling. In another example, in India, many parents tended to focus their resources on the one child they perceived as brightest, hoping that child might leap all the way to a good university while neglecting the others who were deemed less promising. It turned out a lot of potential was being wasted because those average kids weren't getting support to master even basic reading and math. How to address this? Banerjee and Duflo discussed the remarkable work of an NGO called Pratham. Instead of the typical approach, pumping in more textbooks or expanding school infrastructure, Pratham tried something different. They hired local women as tutors to run remedial education sessions for children who were lagging behind in government schools. These community tutors focused on basic skills, literally making sure a fifth grader who couldn't read a second grade passage got that foundation, rather than marching through the regular curriculum that assumed all kids were on track. The effect was dramatic. For very little cost, these tutoring programs boosted learning outcomes significantly for those kids who had fallen through the cracks. It proved that one reason poor children weren't learning wasn't lack of ambition or innate ability. It was simply that schools and parents often focused only on the top performers and on completing the syllabus, leaving many students lost. By teaching at the right level, Pratham showed huge gains, and this approach has since been replicated widely. The takeaway is that improving education for the poor might not require huge systemic overhauls at first. Even incremental improvements like extra tutoring or better aligned teaching methods can make a big difference. The authors advocate solving concrete problems. If teachers are absent a lot, a common problem in some countries, find ways to incentivize attendance or monitor it. If kids aren't learning because they're hungry or sick, perhaps a school meal or deworming treatment will help. Indeed, deworming children, giving them medicine for intestinal worms, turned out to be one of the cheapest ways to increase school attendance, because healthier kids miss less school. Each issue is addressed like a puzzle. Identify the constraint and test a fix. A recurring theme in poor economics is that poverty often means a lack of access to helpful markets and services, not just lack of money. The poor essentially face a different economic environment than the rich. For example, take insurance and risk. A farmer in a developing country might refrain from investing in a better crop or fertilizer because one bad drought would bankrupt the family, and there's no crop insurance or government safety net to catch them. Staying safe but poor can be a rational choice when the alternative is potentially becoming destitute. Banerjee and Duflo recount studies on offering insurance or guaranteed buyback prices to farmers. When farmers in Ghana were provided a form of crop insurance, they actually spent more on fertilizer and cultivated more land, and ultimately had better yields and higher incomes than those without insurance. In fact, families with insurance also ended up with fewer instances of skipping meals, and their kids spent more days in school. Just knowing they wouldn't be completely ruined by a bad year empowered them to aim higher. It's a powerful illustration of a common poverty trap. High risk keeps people from taking beneficial chances. By reducing risk, you unlock opportunity. In rich countries, we take this for granted. We have unemployment benefits, disaster relief, health insurance, at least ideally, and credit access to smooth over bad times. The poor often have none of these, which forces them into conservative decisions that keep them poor. Therefore, providing some insurance or a reliable safety net can have outsized effects on the choices poor people make and the outcomes they get. This resonates strongly today as we think about global crises. Consider the COVID-19 pandemic. In wealthy nations, governments stepped in with unprecedented aid, stimulus checks, eviction moratoriums, expanded unemployment pay, precisely to buffer people from the risk and shock of job loss or illness. In poorer nations, where formal safety nets are thinner, the pandemic's economic blow pushed millions back into poverty. Some countries did innovate, using mobile money to send emergency cash to citizens. For instance, Togo rapidly rolled out a cash transfer program using satellite data to target poor areas. These efforts were essentially an application of the idea that a quick, direct cushion can prevent a temporary crisis from leaving permanent scars, like kids dropping out of school or malnutrition spiking, which would create poverty traps that last decades. Banerjee and Duflo's work strongly supports such timely interventions. They emphasize that wherever we identify a sticking point that keeps people down, be it lack of insurance, no access to credit, or poor health, we should intervene there with a carefully designed policy to free people to help themselves. Speaking of credit, what about microfinance and entrepreneurship? Microfinance, tiny loans for poor people, was the darling of development circles some years back. You've probably heard of the Grameen Bank and Muhammad Yunus, who won a Nobel Prize for promoting microcredit as a tool for the poor to start small businesses. The narrative was extremely appealing. A poor woman gets a $100 loan, expands her little shop, or buys a sewing machine, and lifts her family out of poverty. By the time Banerjee and Duflo wrote Poor Economics, microfinance had spread globally, but rigorous evidence on its impacts was just starting to come in. They discuss a major study they were involved in, a randomized rollout of microcredit in Hyderabad, India. The findings were nuanced. Microcredit did lead some people to invest in businesses. Indeed, small businesses used the loans to buy more inventory, and business owners saw some increase in profits. However, on average, there was no dramatic jump in family consumption or social indicators like health or education spending in the short run. In plainer terms, microloans were helping businesses, but they were not a miraculous ticket out of poverty for everyone, at least not within a year or two. There was no evidence of people suddenly escaping poverty en masse thanks to a loan. Many poor families didn't even want a business loan because not everyone is an entrepreneur at heart or has the time and energy on top of daily survival to start a business. In fact, a lot of micro borrowers were using the loans more to cope with life's ups and downs, a medical bill, a home repair, rather than to become the next small enterprise success story. Banerjee and Duflo note that most poor people would actually prefer a stable, paying job if they could find one, rather than running a tiny business. Being your own boss sounds great until you realize it often means working 12 plus hours a day for tiny returns, which many micro-entrepreneurs do. The authors highlight a poignant truth. Many street vendors or home-based artisans are entrepreneurs by necessity, not by choice. They have no other option to earn a living. So, microcredit is useful. It smooths consumption, helps some businesses grow modestly, but it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. Banerjee and Duflo were quite pleased that microfinance achieved its main objective of expanding business activity, even if it didn't cure poverty overnight. They regard it as one useful tool among many in the fight against poverty. As they put it, it was not miraculous, but it was working. Microcredit has earned its rightful place as one of the key instruments in the fight against poverty. That measured conclusion is classic Banerjee and Duflo. Not hyping, not dismissing, just following the data. The conversation around microfinance also taught us something about poverty traps. The authors explore why most micro businesses don't grow beyond a subsistence level. One theory they discuss is that of a possible capital hump. Maybe a small shop stays small because it would take a big infusion of capital to reach the next level, say turning a one-woman tailoring gig into a dress shop with multiple sewing machines. If a $50 loan isn't enough to climb that hill, the business plateaus, the owner might not even bother to invest beyond a point because she knows she can't get to the scale where profits really jump. This is an example of a nonlinear growth path. If you're below a certain threshold, you're stuck, but if you somehow get above it, you could thrive. In Poor Economics, Banerjee and Duflo suspect such S-shaped curves may exist in some cases, meaning poverty trap at the micro level, and they cite evidence and examples. Although as researchers, they also note counter-arguments in cases where even small investments do continuously add up without a big threshold. It might not be the same in every context. What's important is that for some very poor individuals, a big push, not just a tiny loan, might be needed to truly launch them on a better trajectory. This has led to what we now call graduation programs, because they aim to help the ultra-poor graduate out of extreme poverty. In Bangladesh, for instance, an NGO, BRAC, pioneered a program giving a cow or a few goats to the poorest women in a village, along with training and support for a year. This isn't a loan, it's an asset transfer, essentially a grant of livestock which starts generating income, milk, offspring, if tended well. The women also got a small stipend while learning to manage the asset and save money, plus basic health services. Studies of these programs in multiple countries showed very promising results. Even after the program ended, many of these families continued to do better than they would have without the help. They ate more, earned more, and didn't fall back into extreme poverty. Crucially, the fear that giving things away might make people lazy did not materialize. In these big push programs, recipients worked as much or more than before. They used the boost to improve their livelihoods rather than sitting back. This finding is echoed in other contexts as well, and it's a vital insight. When you give the poor the means to improve their lives, they generally grab it with both hands. They don't suddenly become idle. If anything, they become more productive. This directly feeds into today's debate on universal basic income, UBI. The idea of giving everyone a flat cash payment regularly. One of the biggest concerns critics voice about UBI is, won't people stop working if they just get money for free? According to Banerjee and Duflo, who have studied cash transfer programs, the evidence so far says no, that's largely a myth. Data from various UBI pilots and cash transfer programs around the world suggest that people generally do not quit work en masse or become lazy when they receive free money. In fact, many keep working and use the extra income to improve their situation, maybe start a small venture, get better nutrition, or take care of their kids' needs. The authors highlight, for example, that in those graduation programs where extremely poor folks got assets or cash, the beneficiaries did not cut back their work hours compared to non-beneficiaries. This conversation isn't just theoretical. Right now, the world is experimenting with cash transfer schemes on an unprecedented scale. Kenya is hosting the largest long-term randomized trial of UBI, led in part by researchers like Banerjee himself. Thousands of people in villages are getting either regular monthly payments or a big lump sum grant, and the outcomes are being tracked over more than a decade. Early results are intriguing. One finding is that a single lump sum, a big one-time payment, can have lasting benefits, potentially more than the same amount drip-fed in monthly installments. Why? Possibly because a lump sum lets a family make a major investment, like buying a cow or opening a store, that they couldn't with smaller trickles of money. A monthly stipend, meanwhile, provides steady support, but might mostly go to daily needs. Both approaches have merits, and only through such experiments can we learn which works best for improving livelihoods. Elsewhere, Finland did a trial giving unemployed people a basic income for 2 years, and some U.S. cities have tried guaranteed income for select residents. The fact that governments and nonprofits are doing these tests is a testament to the impact of Banerjee and Duflo's ethos. Don't speculate, test it. And indeed, their influence is visible. They won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2019 for this experimental approach to alleviating global poverty, by which time their methods had become mainstream in development policy. Finally, poor economics doesn't ignore the bigger picture, the role of institutions and politics. You might wonder, if all these micro-interventions are so great, why don't governments just adopt them en masse? This is where Banerjee and Duflo discuss what they call the 3 I's that often impede effective policy: ideology, ignorance, and inertia. Ideology we've touched on. Preconceived beliefs, like handouts are bad or markets solve everything, that make policymakers dismiss evidence contrary to their views. Ignorance is simply lack of awareness. Many decision makers might not know what the latest research says, or even what the real conditions are on the ground. Inertia is the tendency of bureaucracies and systems to stick to the status quo, doing things the way they've always been done, even if those ways don't work well, because change is hard and sometimes politically risky. Breaking through the 3 I's is tough. The authors share stories of policies that failed not due to bad intentions, but because the people in charge had the wrong mental model of the world. Maybe a government assumed a poverty trap that wasn't there, pouring resources into a problem that wasn't actually the binding constraint, or conversely ignored a real trap that was holding people back. Overcoming these pitfalls requires the patient, step-by-step approach championed in the book. Identify the specific problem, try a solution, measure it, iterate. It also requires communication. convincing leaders and the public to pay attention to evidence. Banerjee has mentioned that even after you have the evidence, you need to market it to policymakers and voters. There's a layer of persuasion required to turn knowledge into action, which is a lesson they learned through years of trying to scale up successful pilots. Despite these challenges, the tone of poor economics is cautiously optimistic. It's not a naive optimism that expects to end poverty overnight. Rather, it's the optimism that comes from seeing many small victories add up. The book essentially says, don't be paralyzed by the enormity of global poverty. Yes, it's a huge problem, billions of people, complex causes, but if you break it down into a set of concrete problems and solve them one by one, you make real progress. Provide a village with clean water or a simple chlorine dispenser so they don't have to boil water every day. Give farmers better information about crop prices. Ensure a clinic actually has nurses and medicines on duty. Help a family afford school fees with a small scholarship. Each of these is a winnable battle. Over time, winning many such battles improves lives and can even transform communities. Banerjee and Duflo point out that from around 2000 to 2015, the world saw remarkable gains. Global extreme poverty fell sharply, child mortality dropped, life expectancy rose. Those gains didn't come from one giant program. They were the sum of many targeted efforts: mass immunization campaigns, better schools, better economic opportunities, etc. It's unfortunate that crises like COVID-19 and new conflicts have set back some of that progress. But the overall lesson stands: progress is possible, and we know how to do a lot of it already. Today, as we grapple with the aftermath of a pandemic, with inflation squeezing budgets worldwide, and with debates on big policies like universal basic income or climate-related aid, the core message of poor economics is more relevant than ever. That message is: listen to the evidence, trust the data over dogma, and never underestimate the ingenuity of the poor themselves. Rather than feel overwhelmed by poverty as an insurmountable fact of life, we should see it as a series of solvable problems. Some solutions will be high-tech, maybe mobile cash transfers or new vaccines. Others will be oddly simple, like a bag of lentils or a free bed net. Some will focus on empowering individuals, like giving a small business owner a loan or an asset. Others on fixing institutions, like improving a public health service. There is no one-size-fits-all answer, and that's okay. In place of one sweeping solution, we have a toolbox of many specific solutions. With rigorous research and an open mind, we can keep expanding that toolbox. In a way, Banerjee and Duflo ask us to approach global poverty not as charity and not as a grand war either, but as a patient quest, a quest for knowledge that leads to action. They urge us to think again, to constantly challenge our assumptions about the poor. The poor are not lazy. When given opportunities, they seize them. The poor are not clueless. They often understand their situation better than any outside expert, but they lack ways to make their plans reality. Perhaps most importantly, the poor are not all the same. Context matters tremendously. A solution that works wonders in one village might flop in another if people's needs or environment differ. That's why the book argues for tailoring interventions to local realities and scaling up only what truly works in each context. To wrap up, imagine we're putting together a 25-minute YouTube explainer, which in fact we are, summarizing all this. What have we learned? We learned that big debates about poverty can sometimes miss the humans at the heart of it. By zooming in, Banerjee and Duflo revealed a richer, poor economics, the logic in the lives of the poor. We saw that small changes, a little nudge, a better piece of information, a free mosquito net, can yield large benefits. We connected those lessons to today's issues: how social support during a pandemic or inflation wave can prevent people from spiraling into destitution, how experimenting with ideas like UBI is the logical continuation of the experimental approach championed in poor economics, and how evidence has changed minds and policies. Remember the great bednet debate where evidence trumped ideology. The tone we've maintained is conversational and explanatory, just as requested, because these ideas are both profound and accessible. They're not esoteric theories. They're common sense insights backed by data and stories. And perhaps the most heartening insight of all is that fighting poverty is not hopeless. Yes, we face new challenges, climate change, new diseases, economic upheavals, but the approach outlined by Banerjee and Duflo gives us a way to tackle them, one careful step at a time. As they say, it's like a quiet revolution. No big slogans, just rolling up our sleeves and figuring out what helps a poor family improve their lot. Then doing it, and then doing it again, millions of times over. In time, those millions of small victories amount to transformational change. It may not be flashy, it may not make headlines as much as grand speeches do, but it works, and ultimately, that's a radically hopeful message. By rethinking poverty through this lens, poor economics doesn't just analyze poverty, it points the way to actually reducing it, showing us that a world without extreme poverty, while not here yet, is achievable if we combine human empathy with scientific rigor. So next time you hear someone confidently declare a one-line solution for global poverty or dismiss aid as always useless, you can pause and say, well, it's a bit more complicated. Let's see what the evidence says. That mindset shift towards nuance, context, and curiosity is the lasting gift of poor economics. It's a mindset that treats the poor with dignity, recognizing them as individuals making the best decisions they can, and it treats anti-poverty policies as things we can test and improve, rather than matters of doctrine. In a world full of sweeping theories and polarized opinions, this book's humble, practical approach is like a breath of fresh air. It tells a story that is both educational and deeply inspiring. The story that by understanding the economics of the poor, we can radically rethink and improve the way we fight global poverty, one insight at a time.